Sophia, a poised and accomplished black woman in her mid-40s, boarded the flight with a mix of calm and apprehension. She was traveling with her boss, Mr. Carter, a sharp yet occasionally abrasive man in his early 40s. The two had just wrapped up an intense week of work, and this flight was supposed to be a quiet, uneventful journey home. However, something in the air felt different to Sophia, a subtle tension she couldn't quite shake. Sophia had always been a model of grace under pressure. Her career as a senior project manager had trained her to navigate high-stakes situations with composure. Today, she wore her signature style, a crisp white blouse with a delicate floral pattern, paired with a tailored black skirt that ended just above her knees. Her black hair, naturally wavy, was tied back in a sleek ponytail, giving her an air of both professionalism and elegance. Seated by the window, Sophia stared out at the airport runway, the hum of the plane's engines providing little comfort against the storm of thoughts in her mind. Sitting beside her, Mr. Carter busied himself with his tablet, scrolling through reports with his characteristic focus. His dark blue suit, slightly oversized for his lanky frame, gave him an unassuming appearance that belied his sharp mind and no-nonsense attitude. As the plane began to fill with passengers, Sophia adjusted her seatbelt and took a deep breath. She had chosen the emergency exit row for its extra legroom, but the proximity to the exit made her uneasy. Little did she know, this flight would soon become a pivotal moment, testing her patience, dignity, and ability to stand up for herself in ways she had never anticipated. As the flight began boarding, Sophia settled into her seat in the emergency exit row, grateful for the extra legroom. She adjusted her seatbelt and glanced out the window, attempting to steady her nerves. The hum of the plane's engines was a faint distraction from her unease about sitting near the exit, a choice she made for comfort but one that came with an underlying sense of responsibility. The passengers around her were settling in and the atmosphere seemed routine, until a flight attendant briskly approached her row. Her name tag read Martha, and she was a tall woman with sharp features and an air of impatience. Her orange scarf, part of the airline's uniform, swayed slightly as she walked. Without so much as a smile, Martha stopped by Sophia's seat, her expression tightening as she looked down. "You need to move," Martha said, her voice loud and firm enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers. Sophia blinked, caught off guard by the abruptness. "Pardon me?" she asked politely, unsure of what had prompted the demand. Martha's eyes narrowed. "This is the emergency exit row. You're too large to sit here," she stated flatly, her tone carrying no trace of discretion. The words hung in the air, sharp and stinging. Sophia froze, her mind racing to comprehend what had just been said. Around her, passengers shifted uncomfortably, some sneaking glances while others pretended not to hear. The humiliation was immediate and searing. "I'm sorry, but," Sophia began, her voice quiet, but Martha cut her off mid-sentence. "No excuses," she snapped, her tone cold and dismissive. "You'll need to move. I'll find you another seat." Sophia felt her cheeks flush as the weight of Martha's words settled in. She wasn't overweight, she prided herself on staying active, but the comment struck deeply, challenging her confidence. Feeling the eyes of other passengers burning into her, Sophia hesitantly stood, gathered her belongings, and followed Martha. The exchange left her feeling exposed, belittled, and deeply humiliated. As she walked to her new seat, she resolved to hold back her tears and find a way to reclaim her dignity. Sophia stood from her seat, her legs feeling unsteady as she complied with Martha's sharp command. The flight attendant barely glanced back as she led Sophia down the aisle, her demeanor cold and dismissive. Every step felt like a spotlight was on her. She could sense the passengers' eyes following her, some filled with curiosity, others with sympathy or unease. It was as if the cabin had grown quieter, the hum of the engines unable to drown out the heavy silence of her humiliation. Martha stopped abruptly and gestured toward an empty middle seat in the back of the plane, far from the emergency exit row. The placement was noticeably cramped, wedged between two strangers, with limited legroom. Without so much as a word, Martha gestured for Sophia to sit, her indifference adding to the sting of the moment. Sophia hesitated, clutching her bag tightly, but Martha's impatient sigh prompted her to quickly lower herself into the seat. As Sophia settled in, she felt an overwhelming wave of emotions. Embarrassment was the most prominent, mingling with frustration and disbelief. She adjusted her blouse, smoothing out the fabric as if it might restore some semblance of her composure. Her new seat was noticeably less comfortable. The armrests were too close together, and the air around her felt stifling, a sharp contrast to the extra space she had chosen for herself earlier. Her neighbors shifted awkwardly, giving her fleeting glances but saying nothing. The man to her left was focused on a magazine, his eyes darting between the pages and the aisle, clearly aware of what had just happened. The woman to her right fidgeted with her phone, her body language stiff and uncomfortable. Sophia could feel their unspoken sympathy, but it only amplified her discomfort. She stared ahead, her vision unfocused, as she tried to suppress the tears welling in her eyes. Her thoughts swirled in chaotic loops, replaying Martha's cruel words and the way she had been ordered to move, as though she were an inconvenience, not a paying passenger. The humiliation weighed heavily on her, making her feel small and powerless. Sophia had faced challenges before. Her career demanded resilience, but this was different. This was personal, a public degradation that struck at the core of her dignity. The voices of the passengers in the surrounding rows were a low murmur, blending with the steady hum of the plane. Though no one spoke directly to her, Sophia felt as though every whisper was about her, every sideways glance a judgment of her worth. She gripped her hands tightly in her lap, her knuckles whitening as she forced herself to stay composed. She couldn't let her emotions show. The last thing she wanted was to draw more attention to herself. Martha, meanwhile, moved briskly back toward the front of the plane, her posture stiff and her expression neutral. It was as if the incident had meant nothing to her, just another task to check off her list. For Sophia, however, the encounter had left a deep mark. The ache in her chest wasn't just from embarrassment. It was the sense of injustice, of being stripped of her humanity in front of a cabin full of strangers. Taking a deep breath, Sophia resolved to keep her head high. She wouldn't let this one incident define her or ruin the entire flight. Despite the humiliation, she reminded herself of her worth and dignity. She reached into her bag and pulled out a notebook, flipping to a blank page. Writing had always been her outlet, and now, as the plane prepared to taxi down the runway, she began jotting down her thoughts. Each word she wrote felt like reclaiming a piece of herself, a small act of defiance against the sting of Martha's cruelty. As the plane finally began its ascent, Sophia looked out of the small window by the row, the clouds rolling past. In that moment, she made a quiet promise to herself. She wouldn't let this flight end without standing up for her dignity, not just for her sake, but for anyone who had ever been treated as less than they deserved. Sophia sat in her cramped seat, the discomfort in her lower abdomen steadily growing. The need to use the restroom had become impossible to ignore, but the thought of interacting with Martha again made her hesitate. She shifted in her seat, trying to hold off the inevitable, but after several minutes of increasing urgency, she realized she had no choice. Taking a deep breath, Sophia unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, steadying herself against the wobble of the plane. The aisle felt like an endless stretch as she made her way toward the front where Martha was stationed. Sophia's steps were tentative, her stomach tight with apprehension. When she finally reached the flight attendant, Martha glanced up, her expression hardening the moment she saw who was approaching. Sophia hesitated for a moment before gathering her courage and speaking. "Excuse me," Sophia began politely, keeping her voice steady. May I use the restroom?" Martha's lips twisted into a condescending smirk. She folded her arms across her chest, the sharp lines of her uniform accentuating her stern demeanor. "The only way to use the restroom," she said loudly, her voice cutting through the soft murmur of the cabin, "is to call the captain and ask him to stop the plane." The sarcasm in her tone was unmistakable, and the words stung more than Sophia had anticipated. A wave of humiliation washed over her as nearby passengers turned to watch the exchange. Some stared openly while others quickly looked away, their discomfort evident. Sophia's cheeks flushed, and for a moment she felt frozen in place, unsure of how to respond. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble," Sophia stammered, her voice barely audible. She had expected professionalism, perhaps even a hint of empathy, but Martha's dismissive attitude left her feeling small and insignificant. Martha's eyes narrowed, and she waved a hand dismissively. "Well, if you're so desperate, go ahead," she said, her tone laced with impatience. "Just don't expect any special treatment." The words hung in the air, and Sophia felt a deep ache in her chest. The passengers who had overheard began whispering among themselves, their hushed tones doing little to mask their curiosity or judgment. Sophia's hands trembled slightly as she turned away, the weight of the encounter pressing down on her like a physical force. As she made her way back to her seat, the aisle seemed longer than before. Her steps felt heavy, her embarrassment growing with each glance cast in her direction. She could hear snatches of conversation behind her, some sympathetic, others critical. Every word, every murmur, felt like another blow to her confidence. When she reached her seat, Sophia sank into it, her hands gripping the armrests as she fought to steady her breathing. Alan, seated beside her, glanced over with a furrowed brow. "What happened?" he asked quietly, his voice tinged with concern. "Nothing," Sophia replied, her tone flat and unconvincing. "It's fine." But it wasn't fine. The sting of Martha's words and the public nature of the encounter had left a deep mark. Sophia's mind raced, replaying the exchange over and over, each detail sharpening her sense of indignity. How could someone in a position of service treat a passenger with such blatant disrespect? It wasn't just unprofessional, it was dehumanizing. For a while, Sophia sat in silence, her gaze fixed on the seat back in front of her. The urge to use the restroom was still there, but the thought of another encounter with Martha was unbearable. She shifted uncomfortably, her frustration mounting. This wasn't just about needing to relieve herself anymore. It was about dignity, respect, and the basic decency she deserved but hadn't been shown. Around her, the hum of the plane and the quiet conversations of passengers faded into the background. Sophia's thoughts churned as she grappled with her emotions, trying to decide her next move. She knew she couldn't let this incident define the rest of the flight. She had to find a way to address the situation not with anger or retaliation, but with the quiet strength and composure that had always been her hallmark. In that moment, Sophia resolved that this would not end here. Martha's behavior needed to be addressed, and Sophia was determined to find a way to reclaim her sense of dignity. As Sophia sat quietly, trying to calm the storm of emotions inside her, snippets of conversation from the row in front of her caught her attention. At first, she wasn't paying much mind to the low murmurs, but a specific name drew her focus: Martha. Sophia's ears perked up, and she leaned slightly forward, careful not to appear as though she was eavesdropping. "I heard that flight attendant, Martha, isn't it, has a reputation for being rude," a man whispered to the woman next to him. His tone was low, but his frustration was evident. "She's been like this for ages. Last time we flew, she snapped at a family for asking for extra snacks." The woman nodded in agreement, her voice laced with irritation. "Oh, I know. She made me feel awful the last time I asked for a blanket. And today she's been on edge since we boarded. It's like she's taking her frustrations out on everyone." Their words hit Sophia like a revelation. Up until now, she had internalized Martha's cruel treatment, believing it was somehow targeted at her. The realization that Martha had a pattern of rude and dismissive behavior toward multiple passengers was both unsettling and strangely comforting. It wasn't just her. This was a broader issue. Sophia leaned back in her seat, processing this new perspective. Martha's actions still stung, but understanding that her behavior likely stemmed from personal frustrations or deeper issues made it feel less like a personal attack. It didn't excuse the humiliation Sophia had endured, but it offered an explanation, a way to detach herself from the weight of the insult. This newfound understanding began to shift something within Sophia. She realized that confronting Martha with anger would achieve little. Instead, she needed to handle the situation with calm and intelligence, not just for herself, but for everyone else who had been treated unfairly. As she looked around at the other passengers, she felt a sense of purpose. Sophia decided then and there that she wouldn't let Martha's behavior go unchecked, not out of revenge, but to ensure no one else would have to feel the way she had. Sophia sat in her seat, her mind made up. She couldn't let Martha's behavior go unaddressed, not just for herself, but for the other passengers who had likely suffered her unkindness. Scanning the cabin, Sophia noticed a younger flight attendant moving gracefully between the rows. The woman had a kind smile and a calm demeanor, a stark contrast to Martha's sharpness. Sophia instinctively felt this was the right person to approach. Gathering her courage, she stood and made her way down the aisle, feeling the weight of the earlier humiliation still lingering. As she reached the flight attendant, the young woman paused, looking up with a warm, attentive expression. "Excuse me," Sophia began, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "I'd like to report something." "Of course," the attendant replied, her tone soft but serious. She stepped slightly to the side, creating a pocket of privacy amidst the bustling cabin. "What seems to be the issue?" Sophia took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. She briefly recounted her interactions with Martha, the sharp remarks, the public humiliation, and the dismissive attitude. She didn't dwell on the pain it had caused her, but the hurt was evident in her voice. She also mentioned that she wasn't the only one who had noticed Martha's behavior, hinting at the murmurs she had overheard from other passengers. The young attendant's brow furrowed as she listened, her expression shifting from surprise to concern. She nodded thoughtfully, her attention unwavering as Sophia spoke. "I'm so sorry you had to experience that," she said sincerely when Sophia finished. "This isn't how we want any of our passengers to feel. Let me see what I can do." Sophia nodded, feeling a sense of relief. It wasn't a solution yet, but being heard and validated was a significant step forward. The attendant thanked her for speaking up and promised to address the situation immediately. As she walked toward the front of the plane, Sophia returned to her seat, her heart still heavy but lighter than before. She had taken action, and that small step felt like a quiet victory. After reporting Martha's behavior, Sophia returned to her seat and tried to calm her nerves. She didn't know what, if anything, would come of her conversation with the young flight attendant, but she felt a small sense of accomplishment for speaking up. As she settled back into her seat, she began to notice subtle changes around the cabin. Martha, who had been confidently patrolling the aisle with her usual air of authority, now seemed less self-assured. Her posture was stiffer, her movements more deliberate. She avoided making eye contact with passengers and appeared to be keeping a noticeable distance from Sophia's section of the plane. The sharp, dismissive demeanor that had marked her earlier interactions was replaced by an almost forced neutrality. The atmosphere in the cabin also felt different. The quiet murmurs of passengers had softened, and there was an underlying sense that something had shifted. Sophia caught a few glances from the flight attendants as they moved between rows. While they were professional and discreet, Their concerned expressions suggested they were aware of the situation and working to manage it. As Martha passed by Sophia's row, their eyes met briefly. Martha's expression was tight, her lips pressed into a thin line, but there was no trace of the condescension that had marked their earlier encounters. Instead, her face betrayed a hint of unease, as though she was walking on eggshells. It was clear that the report had reached her, and she was now feeling the weight of her actions. Sophia didn't revel in Martha's discomfort, but she couldn't deny the sense of justice it brought her. She hadn't wanted a confrontation or to embarrass Martha in return. She had simply wanted acknowledgement that her treatment had been wrong. Now, for the first time since the flight began, she felt a measure of control returning. The hum of the plane's engines seemed less oppressive as Sophia sat back and observed the changes unfolding around her. While she didn't know how the situation would ultimately be resolved, she felt a quiet confidence that her actions had made a difference not just for herself, but for everyone else on board. As the flight continued, Sophia noticed another shift in the cabin. Martha was no longer present in her section, and in her place was a different flight attendant. This new attendant, a woman with a warm smile and an approachable demeanor, exuded a kindness that immediately put Sophia at ease. She moved through the rows with a gentle grace, stopping to check on passengers with genuine care. When the new attendant approached Sophia's row, her demeanor was a stark contrast to Martha's coldness. "Good afternoon," she said warmly, her tone friendly and professional. "Is there anything I can get for you?" Sophia hesitated for a moment, surprised by the change, before shaking her head. "No, thank you," she replied, offering a polite smile. The attendant nodded, her reassuring presence making the cabin feel lighter. Sophia leaned back in her seat, a wave of relief washing over her. The tension that had weighed on her since the beginning of the flight seemed to dissipate. She felt validated not only because her complaint had been addressed, but because she had stood up for herself in a calm, dignified way. In that moment, Sophia realized she had reclaimed her sense of dignity and control, turning a difficult situation into a quiet triumph. As the plane began its descent, Sophia reflected on everything that had happened during the flight. What had started as a humiliating and degrading experience had become something transformative. By standing up for herself, not with anger, but with calm and resolve, she had reclaimed her dignity in a way that felt deeply empowering. The act of speaking up, even in the face of blatant disrespect, reminded her of her inner strength. Sophia realized that her actions had not only addressed the immediate issue, but had likely made a broader impact. The report she had filed and the support from the new flight attendant demonstrated that even in situations where she felt small, her voice carried weight. She hadn't stooped to Martha's level or allowed her emotions to cloud her judgment. Instead, she had handled the situation with grace and intelligence. As the plane touched down and passengers began to gather their belongings, Sophia felt a wave of peace wash over her. The journey had been far from smooth, but it had left her with a renewed sense of self-worth. Walking out of the plane with her head held high, she felt victorious, not over Martha, but over the self-doubt and frustration that had threatened to consume her. For the first time in hours, Sophia felt truly free. This story reminds us of the power of self-respect and quiet strength in overcoming adversity. Sophia's journey shows that standing up for oneself doesn't always require confrontation or anger. Sometimes it's about maintaining dignity and seeking solutions with calm and courage. Her decision to act, even when she felt small and vulnerable, turned a moment of humiliation into one of triumph. Life often throws us challenges, but how we respond defines our character. Like Sophia, we can choose to rise above, turning obstacles into opportunities to grow and reclaim our sense of self-worth. Her story is a powerful reminder that our voices matter, and when we use them wisely, they can inspire change not just for ourselves, but for those around us. If you found Sophia's story inspiring, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support fuels our mission to share real-life tales that touch hearts and spark courage. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and share your own moments of quiet strength. Together, we can build a community that uplifts and empowers through the power of storytelling. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.